Pro Tour Thunder popped off with Esper galore. If Domain keeps winning, then that's my big score. I'm up 5-1 on last week's bet. Let's go, Domain.
It only counts if it mounts. Comment below as we walk through the Week 2 recap of Outlaw Standard. Alrighty, gang. Tier 1 features Pro Tour champion Domain, along with the expected performance of Esper Midrange and Boros Convoke. Temur Ramp returns to the fray despite all the grave hate, and Slowgurk is oozing back with a vengeance.
Tier 2 covers PT runner-up Azorius Control, along with the newcomer Orzhov Aggro, aka Orzhov Bronco. Mono Red continues to pay off with enough numbers to continue its stay here, and Dimir Aggro returns quickly after a week off.
Last but not least, we have our Brewer's Corner, covering a new set of 6, featuring a breakout Pro Tour ramp list, a trophy-winning Izzet Prowess build, and 4 other unique concepts to tune up for your local meta.
Oh yeah, that's going to be hot. Rebels, as you know, we've partnered with TOAMagic on our State of the Meta series. Now, for those of you who aren't already using TOA for your paper needs, click the link below in our description, head on over after the video, and check out the store. While you're there, don't forget to use code REBELLION for 5% off at checkout.
As always, TOAMagic can deliver all your cards in one package with free tracked shipping on every order and over 1 million fulfilled orders to date. We're all about dependability here at the Rebellion, and we can confirm that TOA gets it done right.
Now on to our Tier 1 archetype breakdowns, starting with Domain.
Alrighty, gang. Atraxa got crowned 4 times this past weekend, but none were bigger than Yoshihika Ikawa's undefeated constructed run through Pro Tour Thunder Junction. If you tuned in, you were treated to some of the best constructed play I've seen in years, with tight games, tighter margins, and exceptional lines of play. And let's not dismiss how dominant a week it had overall, though. Domain took a weekend high 12 players into various top 8s, claiming 4 trophies, and all of these events were at least 6+ rounds before top 8, meaning that in general these trophy lists were going 7-2 or better. Now, Max, I think you're solidly ahead now in our bet, with Domain up 5 trophies to Azorius Control's 1, so let's talk about what Ikawa did to evolve the archetype. Now, first, I look at this and I see 3 depopulates as a beautiful hedge against Esper Mid, which if you watch the Pro Tour, you saw how much Esper Mid was there. It was like 30% plus. The Cartographer's Survey, brilliant. Searching for Cavern of Souls, brilliant. Spelunking, that realization that you're going to need turn 4 Wraths, turn 5 Wraths, turn 5 Archangels. You just got to ramp into it. I love that it's trying to push that early interaction, and that's glorious to me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, Domain's basically reestablished itself, but I have to ask, which of the other decks does it need to look out for now? We did see a shift of decks that could beat Esper at the Pro Tour. That's really what people went for. Will there be a colossal shift this upcoming week to decks that can beat Domain instead?
I mean, I think it's back on the hit list, so it's going to have some natural predators come back in. Obviously, we're going to see a rise in the hyper aggro list that are trying to push through it. Control decks are going to start adjusting for it again. It's got a target on its back, but as always, in this meta, there's like 10+ decks you can play. You can't just hedge everything against the best deck of this week, because Domain may not be there next week at the top. It might be close, but I mean, personally, given our bet, Max, I'm just hoping it falls off a cliff and then Azorius Control rises. So, you know.
Wishful thinking. But let's move on to the most popular deck of the moment, Esper Midrange.
So Esper Midrange was the chosen archetype of nearly a third of all pro players this past weekend, making it the de facto deck to beat. Everyone came with game plans for this archetype, yet Esper still managed to slot 2 pros into that top 8, though ultimately none made it past the semifinals. However, the second chance PT qualifier this past Saturday was taken down by David Ye on Esper Midrange, with a total of 10 players making top 8s over the weekend. Thus, here we are again, trying to sort through the puzzle that is this mishmash of the greatest hits across 3 colors. Now, I look at this and I see an absence of No More Lies, favoring Tishana's Tidebinder instead. That's an interesting development, especially because it's pushing us higher on the curve. Similarly, 3 Steps Ahead is sitting in here, and that again pushes us into essentially 12 3-drops. That's a very high curve for this list. Now, we're also doing 5 kill spells, and we've cut that final cut down, which was the 3rd cut down, and we've replaced it with a Shoot the Sheriff, showing that we expect to see less hyper aggro. We need to be able to remove more of those mid-range drops. And of course, you know, there's Pest Control in the sideboard now. There's Rest in Peace in the sideboard. We've got a strong sideboard plan for hyper aggro, for graveyard-based strategies like Temur Ramp. I love what it's trying to do here.
Yeah, it's hard to beat. Athena and me, when we were talking on the Rebelcast, she identified the divide between the Esper builds at Pro Tour, between those that had Wedding Announcement and those that did not. Where do you see this card Wedding Announcement in the deck going forward? Does it belong in Esper?
I think it's hard to say what does and doesn't belong in Esper, because if you look at even the top 8 of the Pro Tour, Wedding Announcement in one list, not in the other. Both lists very strong. Both lists felt very draw dependent in the way those matchups played out. I can't affirmatively say one way or another. I think it's very meta dependent. I think it's very context dependent. And Esper is a deck that can be built so many different ways because of how many cards it gets access to, that it's just going to depend on what you're trying to beat.
That does make a lot of sense, and it definitely tracks with Esper's versatility, which is one of its biggest strengths. But let's talk about another deck, the opposite, a very linear list, Boros Convoke.
Sapoa smashed through a giant 248-player MTGO Super Qualifier this past weekend with their take on Boros Convoke leading the charge, as that had top four had 3 Boros Convoke players in it. Taking a step back, we see that Convoke managed 9 different top 8s over this past weekend, including one in the semifinals of the Pro Tour. Now, one thing I note here, Max, I look at this and I see that Anim Pakal that you were talking about like 2 months ago, and here it is. Yeah. It took down a 248-player online tournament, Anim Pakal. Well played. Now, if you go to the Pro Tour build, you're going to note that the Anim Pakal and the 2 Get Lost have been transformed into 3 War Leaders called Matsura's build. So that's kind of interesting to see that shift, and that's it. That's like the only shift really in this list. There is no Nurturing Pixie in either list, by the way, even though we thought that was going to be the big new card in this list. It's not in the Pro Tour list. It's not in the winning list here. What happened? I'm not sure, but we got to find out. And then there's this divide in the sideboard on how you want to hedge, right? Do you want Urabrask's Forge? Do you want Rest in Peace? Do you have room for those knockout blows? Do you really need 3 End the Festivities? It depends, meta to meta, but clearly this one was built well for that meta.
Yeah, it truly was. I think it sized up pretty well, given the overall performance. But in light of dominance that day, by Esper decks, Temur decks, Domain, of course, where do you see this deck next week? Is it still going to be tier 1 considering all of those matchups?
Yeah, I think tier 1 to a degree also comes into how viable is it to build a deck and how viable is it to pilot a deck. And Boros Convoke is a deck that you can just run hot and get there. You know what I mean? It's cheap to build. It's pretty easy to pilot, very linear in most of its decisions. And I got to assume anybody that doesn't want to shell out $100 for Shieldreds starts looking at decks like Boros Convoke and thinking, you know what, I could build an entire deck for that Shieldred price. So I do think it's going to be around, if only because it's so cheap and efficient to build, play, and get to tournaments with. And we know it's at least got the power level to clear through a tournament, as we just saw.
Oh yeah, I like it cheap. I built Boros Convoke myself in paper for that reason. Right. But let's talk about Temur Ramp, or Temur Analyst.
With Sean Goddard's Temur Ramp up 2 games pre-board to Ikawa's Domain list and PT Thunder Junction this last Saturday, did any of us really expect to see that full post-board reverse sweep? I mean, I didn't. I know I didn't. Yet here we are, with Temur Ramp managing a top 8 finish at the toughest constructed event in Standard, while also notching a full 6 players top 8s across various events this past weekend. Just enough to guarantee another week in the sun for the deck that we thought might fall off a cliff with the reprint of Rest in Peace. Now, let's talk about how this archetype is changing with the times. First and foremost, hello, Fires of Victory. Did not know this was the new tech. Love seeing it, though. Well played. I mean, it fits. It fits. Early on, you need to have the ability to interact, and mid-game, you now have the ability to not only interact, but replace itself so you're not losing card advantage. I like that. I like what it's trying to do there. Instead of running those Vampire Vengeances in the main, it's saying a little spot removal. We just need to stem the tide long enough to get to ill-timed explosion. So it's with Shigeki in the main as well. Love seeing that return, and we watched how strong that was in that Domain matchup. Just channeling back, grabbing those World Soul Rages. Like, it's a strong list. I think it's a good starting place.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned Rest in Peace. That did not turn out to be the end of this deck as we predicted before Thunder Junction release. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that now we're going to need even more graveyard hate to combat Temur Ramp? Or is this deck going to just shrug off any graveyard hate that comes its way?
Well, the fact that this list is running 3 Pick Your Poison in the sideboard is, I think, the piece that we were not necessarily thinking about with Rest in Peace being printed. Because, you know, they go turn 2 Rest in Peace, yeah, that sucks. But if you get to go Pick Your Poison, sack the enchantment, okay, now we're back in it. You know what I mean? And the beauty of it is that Esper Midrange is so big, and Pick Your Poison eats Rafine. So you don't mind having those in. They have enough targets between Bats, Rafines, Rest in Pieces that you're totally content to bring in Pick Your Poison against a lot of different matchups so that it'll hit the early hate cards, but it'll also just hit the early tempo plays and buy you that time. So I don't know that there's any safe way to grave hate them at this point, which means it might just be sticking around.
Oh boy, that doesn't sound good for me. In any event, let's talk about a deck that came seemingly out of nowhere during the Pro Tour, 4-color Slogurk.
Now, Rai Zhang and Jason Yi both made it to the top 8 with their unique takes on 4-color Slogurk, a deck that surprised the hell out of everyone I know with its strong performance this past weekend at the Pro Tour. Now, the fun didn't stop there, though, as 5 pilots made it to their respective top 8s over the weekend, proving that this deck isn't just a one-and-done in Standard, while likely forcing everyone to start shoving those Rest in Pieces back into their sideboards between this and Temur Ramp. There's a lot of graves to be dealing with. So let's talk a little bit about what changed in this deck to allow this meteoric rise. I don't know how many people have read through Vile Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier, but this, when you have some Rutsteins, a Relic, you can just machine gun 1 damage per 1 mana, because you're just going to take Rutsteins, which are going to reduce the cost, and you're going to dump them into play, returning another Rutstein. Legend rule, 1 dies. You use Relic of the Legend to make a green mana or a black mana, and you just keep playing them and chaining them and using the Legend rule to keep chaining them, and every time one of them hits play, Vile Smasher triggers. So it's got this like machine gun built into it, and I love that. That's so clever.
Oh yeah, that is clever, man. I did not see that coming. But there were other Relic decks out there as well. They were really in full force during the Pro Tour. Between this and the 5-color Legends deck, which was highlighted by Brian Kibler, which one of those is the best Relics deck in your opinion?
I think the ones we saw in the top 8 were probably the strongest version of the deck. I think Kibler's list is way more fun. I looked at it. I haven't had a chance to play it, but I just saw the cards and I'm like, oh, I want to play this list. Like, it looks way more fun. But in terms of tight play, consistent lines, Kibler clearly did not manage to pull that off with what he had. So I'm going to go with the deck with the results, as always.
Yeah, that tracks. And we're done now with Tier 1. Let's go on down to Tier 2, where I will kick things off with Azorius Control. Yuta Takahashi made it to the finals of Pro Tour Thunder Junction with Azorius Control before losing in 4 to his longtime best friend, Ikawa. Now, you may be wondering why this is relegated to Tier 2 despite that performance. Simply put, and we have to remind people time and time again, we structure our tiers based on the aggregated data, not individualized results. Only 2 players made it into the top 8s across 7 large events this past weekend, leading Azorius Control results to appear as more of an outlier rather than a statement of dominance. Nonetheless, the deck can clearly compete with the best that the format has to offer. Some things to point out here. Let's discuss what Takahashi got right with his list in particular. We have the varied modes on the conditional counter spells, Phantom Interference, 3 steps ahead. These aren't just counter spells, they also have alternate modes that become relevant late game as the counterspell side becomes irrelevant in a lot of cases, especially if you're thinking about the Temur Analyst matchup. Now, we've also got in here copies of Demolition Field and 4 total with Field of Ruin to mitigate the man lands that are frequent throughout the deck, and that Boros Convoke in particular was using Mirax to try to widen their strategy and have some longevity to their deck, and that notably shuts that down.
Now, Max, I look at a list like this, and there's 7 conditional 2-mana counter spells in a world with Cavern of Souls. Is that correct?
Oh man, so I just mentioned the Field of Ruins. I think there are really only 2 decks using Cavern to full effect, at least at Pro Tour: Domain, Convoke, and then I guess the 5-color Humans as well. But for Domain, you still want to counter the ramp spells. You still want to counter Topiary Stomper. You can't afford to ignore Topiary Stomper. It does become a strong body. And then also in the sideboard, you also have the choice of swapping to Negate and Tidebinder to sort of hit the Atraxa to hit the other things as well. So Cavern isn't necessarily the end of Azorius Control. And then for Convoke, you want to swap over to the Lockdowns and the Silex. You still want some of the counter spells, since of course Convoke really only packs 1 to 2 copies of Cavern. And again, you have Field, you have Demolition to take those out if you need to.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, we watched it in the finals. It was rough to see Cavern come down just in time to throw Angels through all those counter walls that were erected by Yuta. At least it was painful for me. I know you were rooting for Domain because of our bet, but it was painful as hell for me. But I feel your point here. Field of Ruins does shore that up immensely. That said, we're going to move on. This has been such a neat list. You actually got to watch me KO somebody right before we started the recording for this. It's Orzhov Aggro. It's the Bronco. We're all about it. Let's talk.
Love a good combo deck. And of course, the combo here is the Bronco with Avarice, with Shadow of Mortality, which is what you want to reveal at the top. Which, 15 damage. It kind of, main Athena, we're talking, this kind of reminds us of Greasefang, just with that 15 damage puts the opponent in a really bad spot. The shell itself is really good. I mean, of course, you've got 4 Sheldreds, you've got Peacekeepers, T-Dogs, you've got Steel Seraph. Those are all really good, strong bodies, and notably, those can all also pilot the Bronco. So you've got that going for you as well. The deck also interacts early. You've got cut downs, you've got 2-drop removal, and then let's not forget Shrouded Shepherd, which can help you in the hyper aggro matchup. If nothing else, then at the very least, it can bring a creature down, cut it down enough for you to apply cut down. And then Orzhov, notably in the sideboard, can use both Rest in Peace and Pest Control.
Fair. And I mean, I look at this list. This is so clever. Like, having 2 Pest Control that comes in for 2 Skrelv is exactly what you want. It's just well done. That said, I look at Shadow Mortality, Max, and I think, is it worth it? Is this just gimmicky? Where are you at on it?
Oh man, I just mentioned that we talked about it in terms of comparing it to Greasefang. I agree. It does kind of feel like that, it's not an OTK, right? It's a combo that does a lot of damage, but it doesn't guarantee the kill. And that's the issue with decks like Greasefang as well. And then the card also does less damage as you take more damage because it decreases in mana value, I believe. I don't know. It might be a gimmick. Either way, I think the shell itself is one in which, even if you don't get the combo off, it's still a really strong shell. But other people have said maybe this card works better in Golgari Midrange, and I've applied. I know Saltminer Chad is one such person. Me and him are both playing it in Golgari Midrange to great effect as well. So I don't know. It might be a gimmick.
Yes, the Redo Golgari list. If you haven't messed around with that, check it out, dear viewer. It is fantastic. We've all been having fun with it. It's hard to go away from the rock when it's so good, but we are going to, in fact, go away from the rock because we got Mono Red to talk about.
So Mono Red didn't find the success it was hoping for at the Pro Tour, unfortunately. Landing 8 pros in the top 32, but none rose any higher than that position. However, it did manage to grab 6 top 8 slots across other major tournaments this past weekend, with MTG Nate One's run to the semifinals being the best result among those. Now let's dissect what it did with this grindy build. Finally, can I say finally, we see Slickshot Show Off on the tier list. We predicted it would come in week 1, but it did not. Red might actually be the best home for this card, as it is the color presenting the most simple options with burn spells for keeping Slickshot aloft and burning through your opponent's creatures. And given a creature-based meta, that might be the way to go. We've got main board Erebras Forge, presenting great pressure as the match wears on, attempting to race a little bit with mid-range, presenting a growing threat for control decks if they don't remove it or counter it. Then notably here, we have 2 costs. That really kind of makes this deck race with mid-range a little bit better, or at least you can consider this an aggro deck that can gain enough damage output in the mid-game to put things away. However you want to think about that, I think that card might fit here.
So I look at this, Max, and I see Slickshot, Forge, Chandra, Koth. This is a red deck that is going farther up the curve than we're used to. Is it clunky, though? Like, do we want hyper aggro for Slickshot, or do you want it to be more like this, where it's almost incidental when it starts to pop off, and they have so many threats that, like, if they hit the Slickshot, do they have the answer for the next sticky threat?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to admit there is a little bit of tension here between Slickshot and these higher cost non-creature spells in mono red. You would expect, right, Slickshot to fit into a lower curve shell, something like the Gruul Slickshot decks that we see, the Izzet Slickshot decks. However, I want to say, Feldon, Codebreaker, if applied with the Disguise mechanic, Chandra. Those present some options where you can play, past your hand size. If you can keep feeding yourself cards, then that point might be moot. I don't know. But regardless, I think this concept of Slickshot in this kind of mid-rangey pile requires further testing for us to know for sure.
Fair. And speaking of a deck that's going to need some further testing, we've got a hot take on Dimir Aggro to discuss. Max, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, Dimir Aggro pushed 9 pros in the top 32 of Thunder Junction Pro Tour, but yet again failed to move the dial any closer to a trophy. However, in the 42-player Champions Cup qualifier in Fukuoka, Japan, one Anan Kazuyoshi made it to the finals before losing to Domain, signaling a strong bounce back for an archetype that actually took a break last week. So, I just want to point out some additions here. Stoic Sphinx is the first thing you're going to see. This card has Flash, Hexproof in the late game when things have slowed down for both you and your opponent. This assures that it can stay an evasive large threat that sticks around to end games with 5 power, evasion, hexproof in most situations, and flash that you can play at the end of the opponent's turn. That's really good stats. Gix is also relevant here, especially because you have the 4 1-drops. Fairy Mastermind is back in the deck. Usually a good tool against Bat, usually a good tool against Rafine decks, at least early on in the game. This deck is still a versatile response to a wide segment of the meta, in my opinion. It draws answers with card advantage, interacts early, has late game must answer sticky threats. That being said, I think the downside is it needs more tuning. It might be spread just a bit too thin against the meta.
That's fair. And now I look at this and I'm seeing more and more just a flyers list. And I'm curious, is Stoic Sphinx like the new staple of this archetype because we're willing to finally just commit to the Sky plan?
A lot of decks are, right? Even Boros Convoke has the Nurturing Pixie, but I believe it is. Not just because it has evasion. Like we also have Aven Interrupter in Esper or in Azorius. That's also being added for the same reason. You want the evasive high-flying creatures, but it closes out games, I think, is what gives this card an even further push. 5 power, evasion, and then the Flash. The Flash is amazing. It assures that you can get in that last 5 damage if your opponent spends all their mana. You play it on the end of their turn, come in and end the game. So I think there's some power to that. And maybe you pair this with something like Bloodletter. Maybe you pair this with some card draw. I don't know. There's different ways for Dimir to go, but I think this card sticks around either way.
Fair. And that's going to take us through the tiers and onto my favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things off with a little Azorius Artifacts. Alrighty, gang. So I know a lot of people have tried different versions of this. This is where I ended up on the list. I know last week we were talking about the Jeskai build, and I wanted something a little bit more simplistic that really just emphasized the power level of Simulacrum Synthesizer, because I think this is the reason to be in Artifacts. Now, again, I want to remind you, there are 3 mass blow up all the artifacts in the board spells, and if they play Brotherhood's End against you, I'm really sorry. That's gonna ruin your day. The only way through that, as you may have guessed from the 8 counter spells in the sideboard, is countering it. That's it. You're not gonna recover otherwise. I have been blown out by it a few times. It's why ultimately I shelved this deck. That said, it's strong. It's really strong. If they don't have the right hate cards for it, this deck will pop through most others. I have ground through so many Esper Midrange pilots on the back of this because the ability to get Steel Seraph after a synthesizer, make yourself, a nice fat 8/8, give it lifelink, it's hard for them to race it. And if you need evasion, you just give it flying instead. Like Steel Seraph to me was the missing piece of this deck that I finally got to. Thank you to the MTGR Discord for helping me build this and test it and tweak it. Y'all are amazing.
Oh yeah, thank you Discord. But let's talk about, we were just talking about prowess, let's talk about Izzet Prowess. So let's consider, why would you go blue with the Slick Shot? With blue you gain Consider, you gain Sleight of Hand, right? You get a little bit of hand fixing, but you also gain Shore Up. Really allows you to defend some of those prowess creatures that you want to keep on the field. We also gain access to the Otter Wizard, right? And Duelist to the Mind. So I feel future builds will, unlike this one, will need to solidify which of these it wants to really invest in and how many copies, right? 1x Duelist, 2x Otter Familiar feels like a little bit of experimentation. Maybe we'll see some more solidified builds in the future. But in addition to those cards, we gain Negate and Disdainful Stroke in the sideboard. And you know how many decks that helps against with, Domain, Analyst, Control all out there. So what we exchange by going Izzet as opposed to mono red with the Slick Shot is less removal and burn for more defensive posturing and a few more prowess bodies around Duelist of the Mind and the Otter. And a meta filled with mid-range and control, maybe Izzet Prowess is where Slick Shot should be.
And to clarify for people wondering why that one, it's because it took down a tourney. It wasn't a huge tourney. I think it was only like 18-ish players, but it did win. So we know it's got some merit to it. It just needs some tuning, and maybe it's a real contender. That said, we're gonna slide on over. We've got a spicy little brew for you here. Boros Pia. This is yet another build that's messing around with Slick Shot, but this time we're trying to abuse all of this plotting by casting Pia Nalar and just getting Thopters. So now we can go kind of wide while we're playing the Slick Shot. Dust Animus is also a lot of fun with Pia, being able to plot that, then pull it out on turn 5 to get yourself a nice Thopter plus a 4/5 with lifelink. It's not a small thing. So this list, it goes pretty hard on the Pia plan. We've got the Ren's Resolves, we've got the Reckless Impulses, we've got the Inties, we've got all our plot spells here. A lot of ways to turn it on. I mean, we've even got Kumano. You know what I mean? Like, this deck is all about turning on Pia Nalar, but even if you don't see the Pias early, you've still got that early aggression with Kumanos, the Swift Spears, the Inties, the Slick Shots, and you've got some staying power with Ren's Resolve and Reckless Impulse. I don't think this thing is tier 1 at the moment, but it needs some tuning. And that's really what we try to focus on with these new brews is what can we tune up and see if we can get it into that tier list later on. So again, credit to the MTGR Discord as a whole. Rebels, you guys are just amazing. You spoil us with all the help you give us.
Oh yeah, thank you. And let's talk about now Golgari Obliterator. Credit to the latter, because this deck's been around in different forms, but it's the return of Fight Club. That's what I like to call this archetype. It's got 6 1-drop fight spells, plus 4 Phyrexian Obliterators. You know exactly what to do. 2 Grixis commands on the top end provide what I would like to call a trampoline in case you fall behind on the board state, which is very important in a creature-based list. But it also has the best of Golgari. We've got the All-Stars here. We got Preacher of the Schism, Aglissa and Gix. We've got Sentinels, and we've got Mosswood Dread Knights, which, all of these cards are staples in Golgari, and they have been for some time. In the sideboard, I want to point out the Lilianas and Hostile Investigators, which present kind of a hand-hate game plan that you can slide in. That also gives you back some card advantage in the form of clue tokens from the Hostile Investigator, which also makes the opponent discard a card. So, yeah, just a couple of really cool synergies put together with some all-stars and a good color set Golgari.
And let's remind our viewers here, like Mosswood Dread Knight plus a fight spell is a really good way to draw extra cards. You don't care if it dies, you'll just keep using it.
That's true. That's true. I like it.
And now on to brew number 5, Junction Ramp. All right, credit to Andrew Kitston. This was the secret winner of Pro Tour Thunder Junction. Andrew did not manage to do amazingly in the draft, which is the only reason that they did not top 8. But this got 24 points, which means it went 8 wins at the Pro Tour. That's impressive. That's impressive. That's out of, 10 rounds, 8 wins. That's an 8-2 record with a list that nobody had seen until that moment. So what is it doing so amazingly? Well, first of all, it's got Pitiless Carnage. Interesting. But I think the real winner here is that it plays Pillage the Bog. In a deck that wants to ramp lands, this is basically playing 4 Demonic Tutors in your Temur Ramp deck, except it's Jund now. So if you like the idea of playing Demonic Tutor in Standard, this is the deck that makes Pillage the Bog pop off hard. Now, if you watch the Pro Tour coverage, you would have seen Reed Duke playing one of these in a Golgari list, and I thought that was silly until I started tuning and messing around with Reed Duke's list, and I got to play one copy of this. Look at the top 16 cards in a game where I had 8 lands, and I was like, holy crap, I'm going to get exactly what I want for 2 mana. This is absolutely Demonic Tutor right now. So I love where this list is trying to go. Give it a shot on the ladder. I think it's got a lot of chops.
Yeah, I love when a new card just gets put in the spotlight and it works when you try it. That's a good feeling.
Right.
But let's talk about this unique take on Grixis Reanimator. Credit to Shadows of Change. I just want to point out some things here, some interactions here. So we have Tiny Bones joins up. triggers a crime every time you play a legendary in a deck full of legendaries. Magda, another payoff for crimes, right? You get treasures. Vadmir gets bigger when you commit crimes. Marchesa puts a card in your graveyard, basically draws you a card. And Gisa gives you a healthy board state off of crimes. How many crimes do we have? We have 14 potential crime sources after Tiny Bones joins up in the deck. So you have a lot of potential within this, I want to call it a Legends deck, really. How do you reanimate? The Atraxas on the top end? Well, with Rakdos joins up. And interestingly enough, this is an enchantment that sticks around. So, you reanimate your Atraxa, it comes in as a 9-powered creature, and then they get rid of it. They take 9 damage, in addition to whatever else, whatever other legendaries in the deck that die. So that's kind of an inevitable win right there if you can manage to pull all that off. You do have some self-mill with Jace, with Tiny Bones, with Marchesa, so that should help you to get your Atraxa in the graveyard.
And I mean, I love that Rakdos joins up, does an efficient job of ensuring that you're committing crimes on the way out with everything they kill. You're just going to get a crime trigger on every death trigger. That is awesome. But that's going to bring us to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming week. Now, Max, we've looked at a whopping 15 archetypes tonight. What are your predictions going into week 3 of Outlaw Standard?
Well, last week, we called the final of the Pro Tour with our picks, and I love it. I'm so happy about that. I have to pat ourselves on the back for that one. But Domain did come out on top with 5 trophy wins. Now, the question will be now if that warrants the target on its back that's probably inevitably coming. How will the meta shift in response? My prediction is we will see a versatile Esper stick around. I don't think it's going anywhere, as the population of Domain and Temur Analyst pilots goes up. This battle between these 3 decks in particular will actually leave room in the meta for decks like Convoke and other hypo aggro lists, maybe some slick shot ones, that will make a comeback, hoping to take advantage of the fact that slower piles are coming into the spotlight. How many steps deep, though, will players go in this meta to combat these secondary decks? I predict that we'll also see eventually a rise in mid-range, especially of the Golgari variety, as it contends with those who want to prey upon the bigger Domain analyst decks with faster, low-curve decks. So the meta just keeps shifting. It keeps tumbling. It will continue to shift around these interactions between these decks, as ultimately I think Slickshot will make an entry into Tier 1 by week 4, followed by the return of what I want to say Golgari and Dimir. I'm feeling bold, going up 5-1 on our bet, so I'm making some bold predictions this week. But what about you, Darth Riktus? What's over that horizon in Thunder Junction?
I mean, hopefully a big score from Azorius Control before I end up on the wrong side of a token generator. However, let's do a quick rundown on what these tiered archetypes are suggesting for the meta in week 3. So first and foremost, Domain is riding high until the meta decides to push back with enough hate to keep it out for a week or two. Of all the simple decks in Standard, I actually think this is the one of the easier choices. The decision trees don't go too far out. The power level of individual cards is obscenely high. I just think it's a great deck. It's a great choice. If you've got the cards, ride with Domain for now. Esper Midrange, on the other hand, there's a variety of ways to build it. Each iteration hedges a little bit differently. If you want a solid Tier 1 deck for the rest of Standard that will require probably a great deal of nuance to build and pilot correctly, this is the deck for you. Boros Convoke is within 5-ish slots in the main board of hitting an optimized build, and those 5 slots are entirely flexible to fit that local meta of yours. So combine that with the absurdly fast nut draws. This archetype is a contender with a low learning curve. So if you're just trying to get into competitive play, I like where Boros Convoke is positioned. Now, Temur Ramp, Slogurk, they're both emerging despite the graveyard hate, which will likely, again, place that graveyard hate at an all-time high. So neither deck is simple to pilot. Slogurk in particular has a level of complexity far exceeding every other archetype I have seen. If you watch those games on camera at the Pro Tour, holy crap, those decision trees. I got lost occasionally. That said, both are a great deal of fun, and if you gain expertise in either, you may get some free wins because your opponents, like me, may refuse to learn them and play into your traps. Now, you go down to Tier 2. Azorius Control, it's got the pieces to beat any one deck, but it struggles against a diverse metagame, which is what we have. And specifically, it still has to contend with all those Cavern of Souls. So the main reason, in my opinion, it didn't get that trophy at the Pro Tour was because it wasn't tailored for Domain. It was tailored for Esper Midrange, and Cavern of Souls was a beating in the finals. Now, I may lose the trophy bet, but I do think ultimately this archetype will be in Tier 1 land by the end of the season, as long as enough people keep the faith. Secondly, Orzhov Aggro. It's a dark horse contender without enough reps for us to really know if it'll survive the culling that most archetypes get when they finally make the tier list and get a target painted on their back. So we'll check back in on this one in a couple of weeks, see if it pans out. And lastly, Mono Red and Dimir, they suffer the same issue to me. They're slightly underpowered, but very smooth tempo decks that will beat the clunky draws of your opponents, but ultimately get wrecked by their inability to push forward if your opponent stabilizes before you get that kill. So all of this is really another way of saying we've got like 10-ish contenders that we are aware of right now, which leaves Standard wide open as we continue. The dreaded all Esper Midrange top 8 didn't happen at the Pro Tour, so we know there isn't a de facto best deck that's going to beat out the rest. It's just a puzzle with plenty of twists and turns left before rotation. Join us. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about it.
Hell yeah. Another week in the books, y'all. We thank you for supporting us, and we want to give a special shout out to our members who support our content weekly. This game is all about mentorship, learning together. So our community challenge for you this week is to send this video to one other player who you know is ready to work hard and improve their game, just needs a little push. We'll be back next week with more analysis.
Until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.